Hi, I'm Mike Zadie. I own Dr. Z Amps here in Cleveland, Ohio. And let me show you my crew, the people here that make the Dr. Z Amps. First is Brent Ferguson. That's my sales manager. I'm sure a lot of you have talked to him through the years. Now let's go through and see the rest of our employees in the shop. Right here we have a couple of technicians, Lisa and Don. Lisa makes all our boards, does all the board assembly. Donnie right now is making our little brake lights. Here are some of the parts, of course, that they use in the assembly of the boards. So all the stuff is here, and there's a couple of chassis, and we kind of stock things where it's easy for the employees to get. Their little lunchroom basically in here as well. Okay, here's the rest of the shop with a couple of amp builders. This is Don right here building my Maz Jr. Down here is Mark Best. Another one of my employees, probably been with me the longest of all of them. And Mark's building an amp, pretty much what they do all day. These are cabinets here that we're storing, that we use to build. The guys behind you are building. We've got some air brakes here, different parts and different amps that are in different conditions of build. Yeah, okay. You know, in the shop, space is at a premium. So, there's a lot of things that we store everywhere. Parts for our cabinets. Right here we do the final assembly of our cabinets. And you can see Pete putting together a Z-Best cab. Over here, Juan is putting together cabling harnesses and reverb cables. This is our dock section here, and this is where amps get boxed up and shipped out to many locations, kind of the last spot that they're here in the shop. And this is Mike doing most of the paperwork for the UPS packing and shipping information. Okay, over here is where we store our transformers. As you can see, we have various transformers that go in all of the different models, and they're from various manufacturers that are built to our specification for the amps that we make. Here's where we store our chassis. The chassis are the foundation of any amplifier. Everything is built on top of them. They're made right here in Cleveland for us to our specification. And we have 4 different models of chassis that we use to build the 20 different model amps that we sell. Okay, here amps are stored for QA purposes. Once they're built, they're brought in here, and Jim does the QA to them. Kind of tubes them up, puts the knobs in them, checks them on a scope and a meter to make sure that everything is correct, and goes through and checks all of the connections. Then Jay here is another one of my excellent builders, and right now Jay's building a Maz 38. Here's a group of my babies here. These are all the amps that we put together. This would be a nice shot during the day before we do our QA testing, before everything goes and gets packed and sent out. People ask me all the time, which is your favorite amp? And boy, it's kind of hard for me to say because each one of them is like one of my kids. I kind of enjoy them all, and they're all very different. Okay, no tour of a company would be complete without talking about a little bit of the history of the company. And right here shows 2 of the very early amps that I built. When I started the company out in 1988, I was doing repairs for friends of mine. I had a degree in engineering. I loved music. I played drums. I was in bands with a lot of these guys, and they would bring me their amps to fix. And as I was working on these amps, and they were quite nice vintage amps, I said to myself, well, wow, I could make something like this. So that kind of sought me on the path of thinking that I could build an amp of my own and start my own company. I've been fortunate through my years of running across people who have been very helpful to me. One of them was a guy named Charlie Job. And Charlie Job was a Hammond organ repairman of great note. If you take a listen to any of Jimmy Smith's jazz Hammond albums, Charlie Job had a lot to do with the sound that Jimmy Smith's got. And Jimmy does give credits to Charlie for the modifications that he did to his organs. So I would go to Charlie's house. And one day I went there and I saw 5 of these little Hammond chassis sitting on a shelf. And I said, Charlie, what are those? And he goes, those are reverb amps. There, you put them in a Hammond to give it reverb. I don't like them. I don't use them. A Leslie is all you need for a Hammond. So I said, well, Charlie, I said, man, I think those would make great little guitar amps. I'd like to buy them. So I bought all 5. I took them home and started modifying these little reverb amps to be a complete guitar amp. So I designed a little tone circuit, which basically was a wah-wah pedal. Is kind of what I envisioned it to be. It kind of sweeps mid-range. So you've got treble and bass on either extreme, but you're kind of moving the smiley face, if you will, with the tone control. I worked a nice volume control, and using the nice transformers that Hammond had designed, it really made for a nice little amp. And I kind of built these amps and would take them to guitar shows. And I'd take 3 or 4 with me and I would sell them all. Stores loved them because their ability to plug in a guitar and get a really nice, clean sound that really got you the sound of the guitar that they were trying to sell. So basically, they didn't sell the amps, but they used the amps to sell their guitars. The amp had a lot of really unique circuits in it that I kept in. One was a conjunctive filter. One was kind of a global negative feedback circuit. And the other was a fixed bias phase inverter. So all of these were incorporated in a very unique amplifier design, and we still build and sell these today. So as I kept going and building amps, I found that, a little amp like this is nice, but you certainly need a stage volume amp. And that's what led me to the SRZ65. Now, the SRZ stands for my daughter, Cherie Rose's Zadie. I kind of name all my amps after my kids or whatever. The Carmen Gias after my grandson, Carmen. And the SRZ65 was basically my spin on a JCM 800, let's say. It had the kind of cascaded gain stage of an 800, along with my own tone stack and driver with 2 EL34s. So as I evolved this product into its own chassis and building it up, again, I used an ultralinear output. I also used a tube rectifier. So it did give it a different voicing as well as a different feel. And it became very popular. This amp was the amp that was used by Joe Walsh on Hell Freezes Over. That was the amp that he used on that first Eagles reunion tour. And that's the sound. So if you think of that kind of basic 70s and 80s rock tone, that's this amp. Okay, that was then and this is now. This is what those models evolved into. This is the SRZ65 as it's presented today. All I really did add was a presence control from that original circuit, and everything else stayed pretty much the same. The same can be true for the Carmen Ghia. I kind of got my own chassis, duplicated the transformers, and built the amp on this format. And the circuitry remains true to that original amp. Kind of hit it right the first time, and I stuck with the formula. This is an original Z-Best cab. When we first had these made, we had them made here in Cleveland, and it was put together by a manufacturer called Best Audio. So that's kind of where they got their name, the Z-Best. I didn't really try to say it with an ego sense to say that it was the best cabinet, but I just tried to incorporate the name of the guy who built the cabinet for me. Now, he built a lot of PA cabinets, as you can see from the way this came out. The port was extended, the cabinet was solid back, and the speakers were front loaded. So we kind of built this cabinet and we tweaked it up and played it, and boy, we loved it. But I thought, well, it doesn't really look too guitar-ish. So we made some revisions to this cabinet. Here's the modern version of the Z-Best cabinet. We kind of changed it cosmetically to make it look a little bit more pleasing to a guitar player. We did remove the back so that we could rear load the speakers, and then also put a nice protective grill on it, recessed the port so it looks more like a conventional 212 cabinet. Here's a gut shot of the inside of a Z-Best cabinet. There's a lot to this cabinet's construction. You'd be amazed. It is built in birch ply, which we use for all of our cabinets, as you can see from the multiply on the edges. And this cabinet, the nice thing about the ZBest cab is that we can tune this cabinet for all three parameters, okay? Well, what does that mean? Well, we adjust for treble, middle, and bass inside this box. We adjust the treble content of the cabinet by what driver we select. So I use a Vintage 30, let's say. It's got a lot of nice high-end bite and throw. So that gives me my treble portion of the cabinet. The mid-range of the cab is kind of controlled by this shelf. And as you can see, the shelf is completely dadoed in this box. It's a very, very rigid, very sturdy construction. Now, by varying the length of this shelf, we're going to allow how much mid-range gets tumbled around inside this cabinet and gets canceled, okay? So what I found was I kind of used a generic Celestion and its mid-range response and dialed the shelf for that speaker. Now the bass parameter of the cabinet is done by the port, how deep the port or how tall the port is. This cabinet is actually tuned to 30 hertz. So that's way, way lower than any guitar can go, but there are harmonics that can come from 120, 60 to 30 that will be very clear and unmuffled inside this cabinet. So this cab really does a wonderful job of reproducing the sound of whatever your amp is putting in it. It's not very sensitive to speakers. I use all different kinds of speakers in this cab, from two greenbacks to a Vintage 30 set or a Vintage 30 and an H30, and all sound just wonderful, you know. I also build this cabinet to be mounted either horizontally or vertically, and I put rubber feet on both sides. And the reason being is if you are carrying the cabinet and you get to your car and you put the cabinet down to open up your door or your trunk, you're putting it down on feet. You're not putting the cabinet down on wet floor, snow, or rain, or whatever. So it's well protected. It's a very well built cabinet. Like I say, all built with birch ply, all dadoed. The whole baffle is solid and dadoed together into a very solid, rigid cabinet.
Carl Verheyen, a little froggy today. I just returned from a 6-week tour, and in the 6 weeks we only had 4 days off, so I kind of got a little hacked up. But I'm here in my garage with my sort of the distortion side of my live rig, and I use a Dr. Z SRZ 65, which is sort of my replacement for the old vintage Marshalls that I use. I've had these old vintage Marshalls for many years. They're the old Plexis, 50 watt, 100 watt, and a JTM 45. But when my friends started telling me that these are too valuable to take on the road, I looked long and hard for something to replace them, and gave me that tone that I was looking for. And this amp came around, and what I really, really like about it is that even though it's a master volume amp, you can crank the master volume all the way up and it's out of the circuit. So it's giving me that big fat tone. Here it is, just straight in without a pedal. You know, it's giving me a little bit of harmonic complexity due to the distortion I've got going in there, and yet it's not completely high gain over the top. For that, I use some pedals on a pedal board. But the way I do it is I come straight into this amp out of my pedal board, Then I go into out of the speaker out into a hot plate. And as you can see at the bottom of this rack, there's a 16 ohm one and an 8 ohm one. That enables me to arrive at a gig, and if it's a big enough hall to where I can use two 4x12 cabinets, one wet and one dry, I'll do it that way. I'll use the 16 ohm one. If it's a small gig, I'll use two 8 ohm cabinets, two 212 cabinets, or in this case, I'm using a THD stereo cabinet, so I've got a wet side and a dry side. The straight out of that thing, I go into one half of this cabinet, so the dry signal is like that. Then I go out of the line out of the THD hot plate into this little Lexicon PCM45 delay, which is a nice sounding delay, and then into the into the power amp of this, because once you're line level, you need to go into a power amp. This old Marshall, it's a 1969, has been converted to have a power amp in. That feeds the other side of this stereo cabinet. So I've got a little wet-dry thing going on. And like I said, in a bigger place, I'm going to use a wet cabinet and a dry cabinet, two 4x12s. But for the garage, this will get her done. I'm actually attenuating 8 dB right here. So if I turn off the Marshall, which is my power amp return, this is the amp. Now, when you use an attenuator, you're squashing it down a bit, so here it is for real. That's enough to scare the neighbors out of the neighborhood, so I'll just back her down a bit. Maybe not that much. By adding the delay side, I get a little bit of ambience, a little bit more talent. And then when I add a pedal, I get a little more. And I use this amp in the studio too. I don't hook it through the whole big delay and Marshall rig because I can do that after recording it on the board, you know. But it's a great amp for soloing. Now I also have an identical one of these that I keep in Europe for playing over there, and I don't have to ship it. And it was made by Dr. Z for the European Voltage. And I also use the Carmen Ghia head, which is a wonderful little sounding head that they make too. It's got one tone knob, so volume and tone, which is great because you turn it to the right, you get more treble, less bass. You turn it to the left, you get more bass, next little less treble. And so just right in that zone, it's going to sound good no matter what. So anyway, I hope that explains a little bit, and I hope the doctor keeps on making such great amps because I'm way into it. See you out there.
Here is the Maz series in our lineup. The nice thing about the Maz is it really does incorporate the kind of holy trinity of amps. It has a little bit of Fender, a little bit of Marshall, and a little bit of Vox. I put the whole thing together and brought it out first as a 38 watt amp. And it was very, very successful and still is successful today. Many, many recordings have the Maz 38 inside it. But what we found is that it was a little bit too loud. A lot of the players today playing in smaller clubs or playing at home wanted a lower wattage version of the amp. So that's when we came out with the Maz Junior. Basically has two EL84s, not four. So it has half the power. It still has reverb, still has all of the features of the 38, and it became very, very popular. This amp today is still our top seller year after year. It just kind of hits that mark. It hits the mark of just the right amount of volume, just the right amount of distortion, in a package that people really like. It's kind of the 21st century's deluxe reverb, if you will. That's what the Maz Junior ended up being. So as time went on with the Maz 38 reverb, people were asking for a little bit more gain. They wanted a little less of the Fendery clean with reverb, but wanted a little bit more drive. So I found that by eliminating the reverb circuitry, I was able to boost up the front end to get a little more drive into the amp. Because if you give this amp all of that drive and you run the signal through a reverb tub, it ends up coming out like a ray gun. If you put a square wave through a reverb tub, it really doesn't sound that pleasant. It's not very musical. So by pulling out, it was a kind of an addition by subtraction. We came out with a new model, which were the NR models, both the senior and junior NR. And the junior NR is just one that we can't make enough of them. I mean, we probably ship anywhere from 6 to 10 of them a week. They just go that well. They're at a great price point, and it's also a very nice amp for a guy. We do include an effects loop in the back. So if someone does want a little reverb, they can put a little reverb pedal or reverb device through the effects loop and have that if they want. But primarily, this amp is made for a little bit of gusto, to have a little bit of drive. And we've also made it in a senior version, giving it 4 output tubes, just to give it a bit more power. But this is generally the mainstay of our product line right now. Here's the inside, or a gut shot, of a Maz 38. The Maz 38 I'm kind of proud of. This was pretty much my first amp that I kind of took a clean sheet of paper and designed, and it is still in production today and in various kind of forms. But right now, here's a Maz Senior with reverb. And I'm going to talk to you about each section of this amp, how it kind of goes together and flows from input to output. Okay, when we go to the input of this amp, one circuit that I use that's a little bit unique is I do use a dual triode. Okay, so I wire my triode as a dual triode using both halves of the 12AX7 for my input. I find that I get a little bit better impedance match to the guitars. It does help so that you can kind of hear specifically the nuances between different guitars. Seem to work a little bit better with a dual triode. And I can get a good gain range. I also do a little corrective circuitry. This little capacitor here, this 500 puff cap, kind of goes from the cathode to the plate. It kind of does a little correction, like a little bit of a local feedback on that first stage of the amp. Moving into the next stage, I call the tone stack driver. Basically, it's a cathode follower that drives the tone stack. It's used in Tweed amps and Marshall amps, and basically the differences between it and other amps is that when you have a tone stack driver, basically you're kind of shaving away tones when you set the EQ. You're driving so much signal into the tone stack that you're basically removing treble, mid, and bass. When you have an amp like, say, a Blackface Fender, where you have a gain stage that drives the tone stack and then a recovery stage, you're actually adding the specific frequencies that you want, and then the recovery stage amplifies that. So we use a cathode follower in our second stage to drive our tone stack, and I do use a kind of a unique kind of tone stack that gives my Z amps their sound. Many people use a .022, .022, which was the predominant type tone stack used. I kind of piece-spiced a few things and found that a 0.1 and an 047 in this circuitry kind of gave me a little bit more, less a broader kind of bandwidth, a little bit better treble, middle, and bass that I liked. From the tone stack driver, then, we go into our reverb circuit. That would be the third tube. And that's a 12AT7, and that drives the reverb circuit. There's a little reverb tranny that takes and drives the reverb tub, and here's the circuitry related to that. Once the signal comes out of the reverb tub, it goes into V4, and V4 again is a recovery stage. So it takes that tiny little signal that was beat up in the reverb tub and then amplifies it. And then we sum the two together, and we use a little differential summing circuit to kind of put the two together. Now, my reverbs are a little bit subtle. I mean, that's one thing that I've heard from many players. They say that it's not as boingy or as springy as a lot of other amps' reverb, and that's by design. You know, I kind of like a reverb to sound kind of ambient. A sound that comes to my mind is how Ampeg did their reverb. It was more subtle. They called it dimension. So basically, it just gave you a nice little swirl around the note. It sounded like you were in a room. It didn't sound like an effect, which other manufacturers do. So that's kind of how we dialed our reverb in. And then next we go to the phase inverter. Now, this is a long tail phase inverter, and it has no negative feedback. So that kind of constitutes a lot of mojo in people's minds when you talk about no negative feedback phase inverter. What that does is it kind of leaves the amp a little bit wide open. Kind of gives the amp a little bit more gain and a little bit more harmonic complexity. Because what negative feedback does is it tries to make the output sound more like the input, and it corrects the circuitry. Fender amps use a lot of negative feedback, and that's kind of why they stay cleaner. Marshalls use a whole lot less. Voxes use none, and that's basically where this circuitry came from. It was evolved from a Vox phase inverter. I also use a cut control, which is very similar to what Vox uses, and that's kind of a final tone control. It basically takes a cap and adjusts the signal slightly to the grids of the output tubes to make kind of the output tubes tone control. And with the cut control, you can go from a very muted, almost Wes Montgomery kind of sound to a very brilliant, chimey sound by just turning the cut control. From the phase inverter, now we go into the biasing circuit of the MAZ-38. This is a self-biasing amp, meaning that we select the bias resistor for the operating point of the output tubes. So you do not have to take this amp and get it rebiased when you replace the output tubes. You just need to get a nice matched quartet of EL84s and plug and play, and you're good to go. The amp then finally going to the power supply of the amplifier. I do use a tube rectifier on the MAZ-38, and we do have caps throughout the amp as well as dual cans underneath the amp to rectify the power and give the amp a nice, clean, quiet sound. And pretty much that's the whole guts and flow of the MAZ-38.
I've been carrying Dr. Z amps around with me on planes, trains, automobiles, buses, and trucks for going on 15 years now because I think they're the best amps out there. I know there's a lot of guys making good ones, and it's probably the best time in the history of musical instruments to get a good amp and a good guitar. The 50s ones notwithstanding, you know what I mean, because so many people have worked at it so hard. I'm just here to tell you about the association that I've had with Dr. Z over the years. I met him probably around 94, 95 in Cleveland, a little place called Wilbert's I used to play at with John Mayall. And I walked in to play the gig, and they had a big 100-watt twin speaker amp with reverb. You might know the one I'm talking about. And it was an awful lot of amp for a little bitty room. And we were having trouble with the guitar being too loud. Imagine that. And Mike Miller, the guy that runs the place, came out and said, you know, I've got a little amp here built by a gentleman that's from our area called Dr. Z, and if you'd like to try that, I think it might work for you in this room. A lot of guys tend to like it in here. And he brought me out a little Maz Studio Deluxe 38, I believe the first one was called, just a single 12, master volume, you know, the predecessor to the Senior, which is the one we have here. And I've played that one for years and still play that one, but the one that I'm most associated with these days is the Maz Senior, which is the current version, if you will, of the old Studio Deluxe amp, you know. A few refinements, a little cleaner maybe. I like the reverb models, and they tend to have a little less gain than the NR model, which is the no reverb model. And I like them a little cleaner and maybe a little glassier probably, depending on which guitar I've got. And I like a little reverb too. Got to have a little bit of reverb. Anyway, Z comes from a long line of prehistoric electronics providers. He was an old TV guy, and his dad was an old TV guy. You know, he tried to make it in the digital world, but it just wasn't to be, because I believe his heart wasn't in it, and he wanted to provide quality amplification appliances for you and I. So then we get into the actual workings of our little appliance here, the Maz Senior Head. Generally with this amp, with the guitar plugged into the high input, there's a low and a high. The low's got a pad on it, which works a little better with the master turned up more. I mean, it works more like a non-master volume amp that way in the low input. I generally run it in the high with the volume all the way up and the master about halfway. That way you can dig in on the guitar, you know, and make the guitar give up the goods. I mean, make the amp give up the goods by digging in on your string, and not having to resort to using a lot of overdrive pedals, which I have nothing against them. I just don't really know how to use one effectively, so I've never have really been much of a pedal guy. The treble, generally about halfway, maybe 5 or 6. I'm sorry, I guess that's 12 or 1, whatever that is. Halfway up, a little over halfway. Mid around 10 or 11 o'clock. Like I say, the mid, the treble, and the cut control work together in tandem to tune the mid-high end of the amp. And it varies in every room that you're in. And usually you get it tuned in just about the end of the first set, so you can rock on the second set, because it takes a while sometimes to get it tuned to the room. The bass control I either leave off, because especially if I'm using a Z-Bass, because it's very, very low indie. So I just turn the bass up to where you can begin to hear a little bass response. And the cut works counterclockwise than what you would expect, in that as you turn it counterclockwise, it gets bassier. And if you're cutting, you know, frequencies, if you turn it to the left, you're cutting bass frequencies and allowing it to be a little more trebly the more you go up with the cut control. Reverb is, like I say, I just need just a hair of reverb. That's really all there is to it. Keeping it set to where you can use the guitar as your overdrive tool, like. I think of Dr. Z as a latter-day Leo, in that he's not one to rest on his laurels and do what's been done before in the world of prehistoric electronics. Like I say, he's been a tube man since the early days of tubes, and learned it from his dad, you know. And was an amp tech around the Cleveland area for many, many years before he started making amps for a living, which he's been doing for some time now. But I really think he has something special to offer all the different facets of musicians that are interested in getting different kinds of sounds. Just go to drzamps.com and have a look and see if there's something that meets up with your expectations, and look for one of the dealers and tell them I sent you if you would.
We've talked about a lot of my designs and how I've used Fender and Vox influences on them. Here's an amp that kind of has more of a Marshall-y kind of influence. I kind of incorporated in this design both the high and the normal inputs of a Plexi Marshall, okay? And instead of like you would see on a normal 4-input Marshall, a player would plug into one input and then jumper the other channel and then use the 2 volume controls to give him a kind of a warm sound and then also a brilliant bite. I kind of did that inside this amp. So now you can get a normal or warm tone in the volume or a high or brilliant kind of sound and blend the 2 together through this input. It does have a shared EQ, and that shared EQ then works on these 2 sounds. But boy, with the use of these 2 inputs, basically you can get just about any tone that you want. A very unique part of this amp is its half power switch, okay? I designed this amp with 4 6V6s, and it has about a 40-watt output. What I did was I designed a half power switch that is completely unique. It's not like any other half power switch in any amp today. And this really does take the amp to 20 watts without any degradation in tone. I mean, it sounds like you click it and you're in a 20-watt amp. You open it up and it goes to a 40-watt amp. So it's really kind of a special control, and you'll see when you play it. So with the combination of a high and a low power, boy, you can use it in just about any application. And with the blended channels, boy, you can really work a lot of guitars and really get a lot of sweet sounds out of the Remedy.
I'm Tracy Guns, and these are Dr. Z amps. And there's not a whole lot to say about them except they're the best. You know, the letter Z. You know, first off, that is the most impressive letter in our alphabet. They happen to be on the most impressive, classy amplifiers available on the market. Let's get into my prescription head, which to me is like the best meat and potato, you know, of amps, you know, ever, because you got all just sounds like a guitar. You know, and for songs like Ballad of Jane and L.A. Gun. You know, it just has like that pure guitar tone without compressing the sound at all. And you know, my volume right there is like, it's like half on the guitar. Now you turn it up and you can get into, you know, the real blues tone just by changing some things on your guitar. that's just like, it doesn't get much creamier than that for blues. I mean, that's it. You know, your soul comes right through the speakers, you know, when it sounds like that. Now, when you want to get a little bit meaner, that's when I'll kick in a distortion pedal. The one that I prefer is the MXR3, Distortion 3, and that gives you more of this. It's a little bit of fuzz. You know? And you notice that it you can still hear the pick, even in the neck pickup. You know, just, you know, hands down, best basic amplifier ever made for blues, country, rock. All right, let's talk about the Remedy, which is the new amp, which I consider my amp because it's the amp that I've always been looking for. And what it does is it distorts in a way that is just pure, you know, tube compression. It sustains for days. Without being overly distorted, and it doesn't mask your sound. So, like, you know, when you're playing like chords like that, they all ring through. Which a lot of other amplifiers I've used, you know, when you're using that much gain, the high end kind of disappears and gets thin, you know. But that's the thing about all Dr. Z amps is the mid range really punches the notes through, especially the higher notes where you have so many quick frequencies. Now, the setup that I use on the Remedy is I have the bass and mids just right at 12 o'clock, so that's, you know, pretty much passive. And I add a little bit of treble. Normally, for all my guitars, except I have a 59 Les Paul, which I actually roll the treble back a little bit because it's real bright. But even my Tele, I still add a little treble. Now, the trick to these amps is right now, let me get into this really quick. You have a 40-watt amplifier that you can cut down to 20 watts with a half power switch, and I rarely use the 40 watts. I'm always using the 20 watts. It's plenty. It's louder than you need to be, but I like it that way. So what I do is I turn the amp on, and I immediately crank the high loudness knob to 10, and I go, all right, that sounds good. And then what I do is I'm going to bring in this normal loudness, and what that's going to do is going to add body to the tone. You know, so you can really, really hear that mid-range just going whoosh. You know, and make no mistake, the guitar is a mid-range instrument. You know, a lot of guys play really heavy, you know, bottomy or really shrilly on the high end, and that's great. But this amp will not allow you to you know, leave out the mid-range of the guitar. So it's a very important thing. So basically, this is the kind of amp, you plug your guitar in, you turn it on, you crank both volumes to 10, and you go. And it's that simple, and this is what I use it. That's what rock guitar should sound like. You know, you use your guitar to change the tone. The amp is always available for you, and it's never going to let you down. You know, the tone's always going to be there. If you're playing a bar that holds 20 people or a stadium, your tone with this amp is going to knock people out. You know, and I say that with confidence because I'm a fan and of all kinds of players, and I know what sounds good and what feels good, and this is the guy right here.
I'm going to talk a little bit now about biasing an amp. Well, first of all, why does an amp need to be biased? Well, when you replace the output tubes, or when the amp is built originally, you have to kind of set the idle, so to speak. And that's kind of where the output tubes sit. The rule of thumb for setting bias for an amp is usually 70% of peak. So you take whatever the peak output is of the tube, take about 75% of that or 70% of that, and that becomes where you want it to idle. When you talk about idling, you can talk about like a car motor. When you come to a stop, you don't want to have to slam the brakes on, meaning that the amp would be over-biased or running too hot. Or you don't want it to kind of stall, meaning that it's too cold, that it's biased too cold, and it wants a sputter. So you want to find that nice spot where the tubes operate and then are very dynamic once a signal is applied to them and they start to operate, okay? So I'm going to use the shunt method of setting up a bias. It's a method that really should be done by a professional. It's you're going to be generating, high voltage. You're going to be going through high voltage points with a meter and shunting right across the output transformer, and then adjusting the bias pot to make the bias adjustment. So first I'll set up my meter to my points, and I'll turn on my amp. Usually I like to turn all the controls counterclockwise so there's no hum or any other kind of spurious information coming into the tubes, because we want them to be at dead idle. We don't want any signal into them. We also want to make sure that our amp has a load on it, okay? So it's operating correctly with a fixed load, which I have on the amp. Once I kick it off a standby, you're going to see the meter start to rise. You're going to see the number increase. And the number displayed on there is basically what current is run through the tubes. And that current is in milliamps. And what we're looking for with the Golden Lion KT66s on this Route 66 is somewhere around 34, 35 MA. So now I'm going to turn the amp off of standby. And you kind of let things settle a little bit. And by making an adjustment, generally when you go clockwise, you decrease your bias or cool the amp down. Clockwise adjustments make it a little hotter. Okay. So when I do a bias adjust, I kind of check in three ways. First, I want to find the operating center of the amp, which is kind of what I'm doing here with setting it at 34. So I know where I'm at. Then I'll run a signal through it. So I'll remove my meter carefully, turn my amp back on, and run a signal through my amp. And that signal you'll see being displayed as a sine wave on my scope. And I'll take it to clip, and I'll take a look at the signal. And what I kind of look for is nice symmetry, not any overshoot and no ringing. And by turning up the bias, now I'm going clockwise, you'll start to see the edges start to get a little sharper and slew. When that happens, that's kind of a not real musical sounding distortion to most ears. So you kind of bring it back until it just starts to round out and be very nice and symmetrical. So I can look at that and I can say, wow, that's pretty much a nice adjustment setting for these tubes. Remember also, this is a Route 66, so it's an ultra-linear amp, which is also a kind of a different setup for most. And you're not going to see any crossover distortion. An ultra-linear amp, in a way, with the kinkless triode, the KT66, kind of acts like a triode amp without any crossover distortion, as you can see. And that kind of gives the amp that nice, big, fat sound that it has. So once I do that, I can take my signal out and I can look at what my bias voltage is, okay? Because this is a fixed bias. What that means is I'm taking and fixing the bias with the pot to a specific voltage, okay? And right now, if I look at my meter, which should be on DC, and I look at my bias point, it's a minus 49 volts. So that's kind of where this amp is biased at right now. When I finish that, then the last thing I do is plug into a speaker and play the amp and listen to it. Listen to its clean tones. Listen to its distorted tones. And then that kind of tells me if I'm in the range that I want to be with this amp. Now, if any of you are going to, do a bias adjustment, just realize that when you're listening and making an adjustment, realize that it's not just a dynamic adjustment, meaning it's not just like turning your volume up. When you adjust your bias, basically it's a closed loop. You're changing the signal on your grid, which then is affecting your plate voltage, and then is affecting the output of the tube. So when you make an adjustment, you got to kind of wait a little bit, let it settle, let the adjustment come in, and then when you play it, then you'll hear what change you made. A lot of guys have a lot of problems. They'll plug in and they'll start playing and they'll start tweaking this pot, and they don't really hear any difference from one end to the other. Well, you're just not patient enough. You got to let the adjustment do its thing, and then you'll hear it. A lot of times if you go to a tech to have your amp biased, it's always a nice thing to say, okay, set it up if you can, get it to within working parameters, and then let me play it. And then make that final adjustment for your guitar, your pickup, and your speaker, and for what you want your amp to perform like. Collaboration with artists also help in your development of products. And that's what kind of happened with the Prescription. We made the Prescription extra strength with a collaboration of Brad Paisley. Brad came here one day, we kind of worked on the amp, and generated an amp that was a very percussive kind of amp with a nice 4EL84 output, but also a foot switchable boost. So we take and boost that EF86 and give you a nice, almost pedal-like drive out of the Prescription amp. What we found was, after we built them and let them go out, that a lot of guys loved the sound of the amp, but it was just a little bit too loud for most clubs and most people's applications. So then we came out with the junior strength Prescription. Used a 5Y3 rectifier and 2 EL84s, which really brought the wattage down to about 15 watts, and also put a post-phase inverter master volume on the back. Now, I was able to do that post-phase inverter master volume because this amp doesn't have a cut control, so that affiliated that design. And it also, too, has its foot switchable boost. Then we moved ahead to the Maserati, okay, another 4EL84 amp, but probably an amp that has, the most train wreckish, if you'll allow me to, kind of sound. It has a lot of gain, and you really control the volume of this amp, or the clean and dirty aspect of this amp, from your pick attack and your guitar volume, okay? Then we moved on to the Stangray, okay? This amp was initially called the Stingray, but I was forced to change the name because there was another guitar company that used the name Stingray. Brad Paisley kind of liked the name Stingray. He had an affiliation with old 67 Stingrays. And when Brad and I worked together on this amp is what we called it. And then Brad came up with the name Stangray. So we kind of went with that. This amp has that sound of that opening chord to Hard Day's Night. That's the sound that was in my head that I was finally able to put into an amplifier. That clang, that opening chord, almost like banging on a grand piano. That's the sound that the Stangray has. It has an EF86 in it, a very simple circuit, but very clean, very clear, a lot of low end. It also incorporates a transformer that was designed by Ken Fisher. Another collaboration, if you will. Ken and I were friends for many, many years, worked together on a lot of designs. And one of the designs that he did for me was this output tranny, and that's what's used in the Stangray. And if you take a Stangray and made it up to a nice 212 cab with a couple of Bluebells, boy, you're going to be in Vox heaven.
Hi, I'm Brad Paisley. That's good coffee. Chad! Thank you. So, I play Dr. Z amps, as you know, and I am absolutely ecstatic to talk to you today about them. The first one we're going to talk about is the Stingray, which actually is now called the Stangray, but this is an original Stingray, of which there were, how many, Chad? You know the answer to that? There were 50 heads sold prior to the folks at Ernie Ball saying, by the way, we have a bass called a Stingray, and we went, that's right. So we changed the name, but this is an original. They don't sound any different. They're actually the same amp, but I'm playing through that in the little clip that you just saw. It's a very Voxy, clean amp that has that British jangle that was designed after I felt like I wanted more of a Class A amp than what the Maserati and the Prescription Extra Strength were giving me. They were great, they're great amps, but they're Class AB, and they have a little more of that thing that Dr. Z does so well, that is bridging the gap between Marshall and Fender. Being that there's that AB thing that happens that kind of has a mid-cut to it. Class A, or what we call Class A amps, have that sort of, have a little more harmonic content. They're a little more cantankerous at times, but they have a certain character that I was looking for that wasn't in the amps that I was using. So we made that, and it's done really well. We've had a good time with that amp. It's a great clean amp. It's not the type of amp that really gets that dirty, not designed to. It's sort of like a Vox that never really breaks up. So anyway, I've always loved this amp for the cleanness of it. It's like a lot of the complaints you get about Voxes are that they're loud amp, but they aren't clean loud. You know, you got to run them a third of the volume or so to stay clean with them. This amp isn't necessarily the case. Trust me as I stand here. That's very, very loud, and it's not breaking up as much as a Vox would. So it's a great kind of amp for that if you're looking for something that has that AC30 jangle but stays a little cleaner. Chad, coffee. It's good. All right. Thank you. So next. All right, now I'm on to the Prescription Extra Strength, which is something that Z and I also worked on together when I was playing the Maserati, the original Maserati, in concert for a while, and it was a great amp for me. And but the thing I was missing was a little bit of bass and volume from it. I was starting to play the bigger stages. I needed something a little bit louder, so he came up with this idea for this Prescription Extra Strength, which is essentially, it's about a 45 watt amp, I think. You can look on the site if you want to be sure, but I think that's right. Which is, it's quite a bit louder, I think, than the typical 30 watt, you know, EL84 based amp. It's also got a little more bass. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it today through this setup, but it has a little more bass, sort of low, mid character to it that you don't get out of something that's 30 watts. And it's a great and very useful amp for somebody playing a bigger stage. You definitely, if you're playing clubs, you know, 200 seat clubs, this amp, you'll never have it past 2. But it's a great sort of middle of the road, not as loud as a twin, but certainly not as soft as a 30 watt amp. also breaks up quite a bit more than the Stingray if you turn it up. Of course, mind you, it's sort of unbearable, actually. All right, the next amp is the Maserati, and this is something that's not the Maserati GT that he makes now, but the original Maserati. I don't mean the Maserati after the original either, by the way, not to be confused with the Maserati prior to the Maserati after the original. But there was a Maserati prior to the Maserati that came after the original Maserati that was a different Maserati because it had a different transformer than the Maserati that was the first Maserati, which came before the second Maserati, which was the one after the original. Follow? No, the Maserati is actually an amp that originally started out with a smaller transformer and a couple of little things, I'm not sure exactly what, but it was its own thing. It was the first Z I ever heard. I went to a music store and I plugged into one and it had two 10s, and I thought, wow, that's just got this great character to it. I wonder what it would sound like with Vox Blues, because I had my old red Vox out on the road and I was just tired of that thing getting beat up and ending up in the shop every time. So what I decided to do was find an amp that would replace it, that would sound great on stage, do its own thing, but have that same character. When I plugged this into two Blues, the original that is, it came out like this. And I was in love with it. Anyway, I bought that at a music store here I don't think is in business anymore in Nashville, and got in touch with Dr. Z and said, I love your amps, you know, what else you got? And he sent me some things to try, and I bought a few more, and here I am today after, you know, owning about 50 of them. It's, the thing about this amp, I've gotten away from it in you know, years since, trying a lot of different things, because you're always experimenting as a guitarist. And in the recording of this new album, American Saturday Night, I was missing that old Maserati, and I called him and I said, or I had Chad call him and just tell him what I was looking for, which was that I was wanting that original thing I plugged into. And he said, I'll do you one better than that. When you came in and we modified your original, I kept everything out of it. I can build you that original amp. I have your actual transformers, everything. I will build that. It'll be that exact amp. And he did. And there it is. That's exactly what I used on tour and on, I think, the second or third album for several years. And now we're on to, well, wait a minute. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. So the now we're on to the Maserati GT, which is a different amp completely than the Maserati that I was just talking about. He doesn't make the Maserati I was just talking about as of right now, but you could wage a email or letter campaign if you'd like to see that reappear. This next amp, the GT, is a really cool amp, but here's the big difference between that and what you just heard. It doesn't sound the same, really. It's as you can tell, I can't really put my finger on it how it's different. It's a little slightly different shade of red, as you can tell. That's really the main difference between the two. I'm kidding. Actually, as you can tell, it's a dirty amp, and it stays dirty from the minute this thing is turned on. There's all the way down. And that's really nice. That's a nice spot for it, actually. But when you turn it up, which is what it's meant to do, really. That's what it sounds like. The next amp is the Remedy, which is one of my favorite things he's ever done. It's a new amp that we've been using live for my lead distortion stuff when I play distorted leads. It's really cool. It's something that it's somewhere between. It's really Marshall-y in a way that Marshall hasn't been able to duplicate in years. It's got a really great plexi character, but at the same time it's 6 V6s, so it's a lot like a Fender amp too, and I've just never heard anything like it. And it's as you can tell, it's a little darker, which I like. It also has a great unique setup I've never seen, which is one volume. There's 2 volume controls per channel, and what it is one is a bright volume, one is a dark volume. You can determine which of those is sort of leading the way and make it either darker or brighter just based on which one you're running the gain up on. It's like jumping the channels on a Marshall amp the way that people used to do, or a Vox. And then when you turn them up, you can get that Tracy Guns thing. Next we have, this leads us to my holy grail for Z amps. Z was really good friends with Ken Fisher, one of the legends of amp making, which Dr. Z is also going to be, but you know, Kenny was one of those guys that even Z, you know, it was sort of a mentor, I think. And when I got to know these guys, Z did something really special for me, and when I told him what I was looking for, I really was looking for that Trainwreck Rocket thing. And that is a really unique amp that Ken Fisher made only a few of, that was truthfully, it's sort of gotten to legendary status. There's only 8 or 10 of those in the world, and they were his version of what he thought the best AC30 was capable of sounding like. You know, that's that total British thing. Well, Z said, I think I can do that. I think I can actually get that at least close, having not even heard one. And then we'll see what Ken can do. So we got close on that. It was great what he did. And then he said, as a surprise for you, I'm sending it to Ken. He's going to finish the amp. And he sent it to him. Ken did his little tweaks, whatever he does, sprinkled fairy dust on it. And there it is. It's a really, really harmonic amp. I don't know whether you'll be able to hear it today through just the room mics that we have set up. It doesn't sound a whole lot different than a Stingray or you know, even a Maserati, a typical Maserati, or one of those clean amps. But what it is, it's the harmonic content. It's something that you have to have it in the studio with a mic on it to understand. And under that microscope thing. As of right now, he doesn't build it, sort of out of respect for Ken. This is sort of I don't know, it's so close to what the Rocket was. I have actually taken this and a Rocket side by side and listened to them. There's a little difference, not much. Not the kind of thing that almost anyone would hear. But this is what it sounds like, and it's got a really wide volume range. It starts out very clean. Let's start with it low. Goes up a little more and gets a little more character. Goes even more, gets more character. And keeps going. Another really cool thing about this amp, unlike, well, a lot of amps do this, but not like this one. There's something about the train wreck engineering of something that is determining where that harmonic content sits, that you can take your volume knob, and here I am. Really cool, crunchy, clean sound. I can go straight from without touching anything but the volume knob, doing a really clean telly country music thing, to this. On stage, I use Z cabinets almost exclusively, and they're just great. They're a great built cabinet. We like to toy with people and every now and then introduce a color that you can't get, like blue, which was fun. On the whole last tour we had, I think, 56 blue cabinets out on the stage, even though I was only using 4. You know, I love that when Z gets the emails from you guys that say, where can I get blue? And he can't get blue. I just sort of like messing with him that way, actually. It's fun for me, and probably, oh, it's worth it, you know. It's just fun for me to tour with him a little bit, because he's doing entirely too well. His business is thriving too much in this economy, to be fair. No, it's a great thing playing Z cabinets, because they're built so well. They really handle the tone. A cabinet is so much more important than anybody gives it credit for. I mean, everybody just thinks, oh, I'll just throw speakers in something, it's all about the speaker, but it's not. It's how that speaker sits in that cabinet that determines what really comes out of it. And it's all about what's happening behind the speaker. I always use open back, that's just, I like that sound. But his Z-Best cabinets that are closed back or ported or any of that are also some of the best in the industry for that, if that's what you're looking for. Truthfully, you know, I think it's a big part of my sound, just the fact that it's that cabinet out there with that Z on it, that is really a big part of this. So hopefully you're running you didn't just buy the head and run it through something cheap. You need one of these too. Well, everybody, thanks so much for, hold on, coffee. What'd you do to it? Everybody, this is Chad. Say hey, Chad. Chad handles all the guitar stuff out on the road for me. You guys see him on the message board a lot. Great guy, terrible coffee maker. Anyway.
Everybody has some flaws.
Anyway, thanks so much for putting up with me on this. Thanks, Z, for everything you do for us, for making legendary amplifiers, classic equipment that will go down in history as some of the best that's ever been. I'm Brad Paisley, signing off.
Inspiration for amp design comes from a lot of places, guys, and the inspiration for the KT45 came to me one day reading Vintage Guitar. there was a picture of an amp that was a kind of a Vox amp that was never released. And it was a higher powered amp that they tried to build and use EL34s in it. They were very successful with their AC-15, but artists at the time were coming to them and saying, man, it wasn't loud enough. We love the sound of this amp, but we need more power. So what Vox did was they kind of built the AC-15 and put EL34s in it. And Vintage Guitar had a picture and a little story about this amp, and I was like, wow, that was a cool idea. But they never did release it because people said, well, it didn't have the jangle that they liked with the 84 tubes. So Vox kind of went back to the drawing board and came up with the AC-30 using 4 EL84 tubes. So that was the idea behind the KT-45. Now, you wonder about the name KT. Basically, this was going to be a kit. So for any of you guys back there that remember the early days of amp.guitar.makers.com on the internet, we were talking about making this amp as a kit. But when I talked to my attorney, he certainly strongly suggested that I didn't, just because of the responsibilities of building an amp like this and having somebody build it and the liabilities that are involved, and then also the time it takes to field all the phone calls and help people when they put them together and they don't work and help troubleshoot them. So I decided not to do it. I decided to release the amp as it was. And it was very successful, sounded great. It had a kind of a nice, almost high wattish sound to it. And from that grew a whole line of amplifiers. Basically, I went from this format design, which was an EF86, a 12AX7, a pair of outputs, and a tube rectifier, to the Route 66, which used the KT66 tubes. Those were available around 1998 when they were released. I put them in this amp, put it in an ultralinear configuration, and made a wonderful sounding amp. I sent it to Guitar Player, and actually this amp won the very first Editor's Pick Award, as you can see, in January 1999. This award was kind of started to kind of give me a little kudos or credit for this original design that I came up with, but also kind of set a format for things to come and how they were going to judge amplifiers in their reviews. So the Route 66 did extremely well and still does to today. So then I said, well, the 66 was a little loud, a little bit powerful. Guys wanted something a little bit less powerful. So that came up with the Z28. Basically, the same format again, EF86, 12AX7, but now I use two 6V6s to get a nice little sweet kind of hollow tone. The Z28 to me is very reminiscent of a kind of a brown Fender Deluxe, the amp that kind of came after the Tweed and before the Blackface. That amp had a really nice clean tone to it, but boy, you could crank it up and man, it'll dance around the room. It really had a nice kind of martially growl to it. And that's kind of what's involved in the Z28. And I use a pretty stout power supply in it, so the amp stays very tight. There's an incredible low end response for two 6V6 tubes in the Z28.
I'm Dean Parks. This is my Dr. Z collection so far. And this is the first one that I got. I needed a live amp quick, and I knew some Pro Sound Communications who were dealing these things, and I asked if they had one. And I'd heard about the amp, and anyway, they brought it down, and it was great. I used it as primarily a clean amp. It's 30 watts, so it's loud. Let me tell you a little bit about our setup here. I've got this cabinet mic that's louder than it seems here because I have it mic'd and coming through my little studio Pro Tools rig, a couple of Genelec speakers, and a little reverb, studio reverb. So there's no amp effects, there's no amp anything. It's just straight guitar into amp, and amp into speaker, and then I'm micing it, and there you have it. So the way this little guy works is, this is the Maserati. It's a 30 watt, and I understand it's similar to the Karmann Ghia, except the Karmann Ghia is about half of that. But the sound is different to me. This is a very kind of clean, I'd say a kind of a clear, warm overdrive, you know. This is, I have it set at not much overdrive at the moment. And as with the Karmann Ghia, the tone control means more fullness when you turn it on. Here is full to the left. By the way, this is humbucker with the front pickup. Volume down on the input. So I usually run it about in here. And then more crank is here's a single coil front pickup. Could use a little fullness, so I'm going to dial a little in. That's single coil. It's not single coil. Here's adjacent Strat pickups. So that's the Maserati. I've used it some in the studios, a lot of live stuff. Put it right on the edge of its breakup and then put some effects in front, and you have your own designed overdrive in front of it. It's good, sweet, honest amp sound. We're on the Karmann Ghia now, which is similar to the Maserati. The one tone control more means fuller. This seems to me, at least mine has, it breaks up a little quicker. I don't know that I could use it on a gig that needed a clean sound. I think it would always be pushing a little bit, though I have taken it to very quiet gigs and it works well. Like in an environment with acoustic instruments on stage, works pretty well because you can get it to its threshold. It's not terribly loud. Here is humbucker, front pickup. I like this for when you want a breakup, but you don't want it tearing. Not a tearing breakup. It holds rhythm, holds chords well. It fits in a track. It's not so tizzy that you have to bring it back and level. It holds its own, but doesn't take over. And it's really great for that kind of a transition breakup chord situation. So, full no tone. Same thing with the rear pickup in the humbucker mode. Here's single coil. Here's single coil. Front pickup single coil. It's really great on the upper strings. It gives a, here's the, like it's neutral tone, I'd say. But you can dial in some thickness there that it doesn't add to the breakup. It just makes it fuller and makes it sit in a track in a really warm way against synthesizers or keyboards. And for lead stuff, it's like a pretty good little blues amp here too. Front pickup. Little soggy, so I'll just back off on this fullness. coil front pickup. So, wrap up of the Carmen. It's a low loudness, good breakup, good, really great for home studio stuff for you can get that full amp sound without huge neighbor feedback. And it's unique in being able, to me, so far, to get that the upper strings in a warm way, slide overdrive fits into the track. I think that's a great thing about it. KT45, I asked Mike what of his amps would be different than these. What am I missing? And he suggested this one. So I got it, and it's pretty nice. It's less breakup. Still a full amp sound. You know, the tone controls work in an interesting way on this thing, in that you have a treble and a bass, but the treble and the bass sort of push the overdrive circuit in a way that if you want a little more breakup from your higher strings, a little more treble breakup, you can actually push it here. Bass sort of is the way it was, but get more spread on the treble. And then the other way around too, if you want to push the bass, get that sogging out a little bit. That is a humbucker. Here is a single coil. Still lots of heft to the sound. Let me show you the drastic range. This is a front pickup. I'll go back to humbucker. If we want to push it for some lead sounds, it's rear pickup, humbucker. Well, here's my little Dr. Z's. Thanks for watching. Tune in same time next time.
We're in the room where we do our QA. Here's where we store all of our tubes. I'd like to take this time right now to maybe explain some of the tubes that we use in our amps and their sonic kind of sound and why we use them in certain positions in the amps. One that we use a lot of is the JJ12AX7. Okay, it's labeled an ECC 83 because that's kind of its European designation, but it's a nice little tube. And we use it in a lot of positions in our amp. It's a small box tube, so it's got a lot of gain, and it has a very kind of universal mid-range kind of sound to it. So it's very kind of mid-rangey, very nice for guitar with a lot of gain. Very rugged tube, very solid tube, and a well-made tube. Then we go to our Russian tubes, another nice manufacturer, sold by New Sensor mostly. This is a WB, kind of a bland tube, if you will. The sonic characteristic of it is pretty flat, but it doesn't have a whole lot of gain. It's not real noisy, and it's nice to put in a position like reverb recovery. Okay, keeping with the Sovtex, this is a 12AX7 LPS. It's a nice little tube that they released. It's an LPS, which is a long plate spiral filament. That's what that stands for. So it's very quiet. It's got a long plate so it can sink a lot of current. We use them in phase inverters. And the reason being is they're very, very balanced. Okay, staying with the 12AX7s, our friends at New Sensors or Electro Harmonics have come out with some tubes that were other tubes' names from the past. They purchased the name of the tube company. This is a Mullard. Now, it's a nice tube. It's got a good first position kind of place in an amp, kind of balanced, got a little, maybe a little brightness to it, which is nice as an input stage of an amplifier. And they're pretty nice. So far, I've been very, very happy with these Mullard reissues. Okay, another rebranded 12AX7 made in Russia is the Tungsol. And it too is a kind of a small box tube, very balanced, very reminiscent to me of the early 7025s that we used to get in the old blackface Fenders. So it's very reminiscent of that sonically. Okay, that's pretty much all of the new production 12AX7s that we use. And that leaves me with one, which is the 5751. Now this is a very low gain, high quality tube that was made for the military applications. In World War II, these tubes were put in units, communication units that were thrown out of airplanes. And they were rugged enough to last that kind of situation. And they're very nice. They're kind of hollow. They have a very low kind of mid-range response. So I kind of like them. I like them as phase inverters in certain amps, as well as the Nashville guys kind of like these in their first position because it's not too much gain. Moving on to 12AT7s. Okay, these are T's. These are Electro Harmonics. Real nice tube that they came out with. Very quiet. A kind of a well-balanced driver tube. This tube is good for used in driving reverb circuitry or even phase inverters in Fender-style amps. One thing that we've ran across is a lot of new old stock 12AT7s. They seem to be quite available, okay? 12AX7s are kind of gone, but still you can find a nice American-made 12AT7. This one's labeled a 6201, which is basically a military-grade 12AT7. And we use these, you know, in our EZGs, in both driving the reverb and also the phase inverter. Now we're moving on to a tube that I really like. It's the EF86. I use these in a lot of my designs. And the reason being is this is not a triode, this is a pentode. And this tube does have a lot of gain. It's used predominantly in high-end stereos as well as microphone preamps. The reason being, it can take a very large input signal and still come out the other side very balanced. It doesn't have that kind of asymmetric clip that we're so used to hearing with 12AX7s. The EF86 doesn't do that. It has a very, very high gain range. A 12AX7, let's say, is about a 70 or 80 output, where these EF86s can go as high as 120 or 130 in their gain range. Okay, and here's another EF86. This is actually called an EF806. This is another new release, a tongue saw, and we've had pretty good luck with it. I'm real happy to say that this is a current production EF86 that I can use in my amplifiers. Prior to that, we've had to use new old stock tubes. Next are rectifiers. Okay, this is a 5AR4 rectifier tube. It's a Sovtek as well. It's very nice. They kind of tried to copy the Mullard tube, as you could tell from its serrated plates. It's a nice, stout rectifier tube, as close as you can get to a solid-state rectifier, but it still gives you a little touch of sag, so a little bit of swell with the 5AR4. Okay, also a drop-in replacement for the 5AR4 is a JJ GZ34. Okay, the GZ34 is the European designation for the 5AR4. I get asked that a lot. Guys say, well, you say I can use a GZ34 or a 5AR4. Well, yes, it is the exact same tube, just different designation. And this is a pretty nice stout tube. It's a new one that JJ has released, and we've been using it more and more in our products. One new old stock rectifier that we use is the 5Y3. We use this in a couple of models that we make, Karmann Ghia being one of them. And there's still quite an abundance of these left. And they're very nice tubes. Rectifiers tend to be around a little bit more than preamp tubes because rectifiers were used in a lot of things. Anything that was electronic in the 50s, if it had a power supply, it had to have a rectifier. So that's why there are so many of those left. And boy, we've had good luck sourcing these and using these in our Karmann Ghias. Now, moving on to power tubes, here's one that we use the most of. We can go through as many as 400 of these a month. And these are the EL84s. Nice little tube, great little output, nice English type tone that you get out of an EL84. They got a nice gain and a nice compression. And many, many designers use these. And boy, it's kind of hard to make an amp sound bad when you use an EL84 as its output. This is a JJ, very stout, well-built EL84. The big brother to the EL84 is the EL34, okay? And that's basically that same tube in a larger size, in a big beamed tube that's capable of, 50 watts in a pair in an amplifier. This is the sound that you hear in all of your Marshalls. This is the English sounding tube, and we use it in our SRZ 65, in our KT45 as well. Okay, this is a 6V6, a tube that I'm becoming very popular with in my new designs. It's kind of taking the place of the EL84 to me. When you compare the two tubes, the 6V6 has less compression. The 84 tends to compress and distort a little quicker, where the 6V6 gives you a touch more headroom. You can kind of take the sound of the 6V6, very similar in the Princeton or a Deluxe. That's kind of the sound that the 6V6 has. The top end's very sweet, never harsh. The mid-range is a little bit hollow, and the bottom end can be very strong if put in the correct circuit. This is a KT66. It's a real nice tube. It certainly has a great characteristic of a sweet mid-range and a nice distorted tone. This tube is relatively new. They kind of just re-released it. It came out in 1998. And when I heard that they were going to put this tube out, that was kind of what prompted me to design my Route 66 amp. And I kind of designed it around this tube. Prior to it being re-released, I had some KT66s that I took out of my stereo, my Macintosh MC30, and I would gingerly put them into design while I was working on them and take them out. And then these were finally released. So in 1999, that's kind of where we put out the Route 66, and we used these tubes in it. And this is a 6L6. This kind of ends the different families of power tubes that I use in my amps. And a very American sounding tube. Got a little bit of toothiness, a little bit of bite, like a nice Blackface amp would have. Sonically is what the characteristic of this tube. Pretty clean, very nice, good power. This is how our cabinets come into us. We have a vendor that manufactures our cabinets, Tolexes, puts them together and sends them to us. We don't have a wood shop here inside Dr. Z's, so that's all done out of house and brought in. Once the cabinet is done in here, our guys take the baffle board and then figure out which grill cloth color is going to go on this amp, and they take and cut the grill cloth. Once the grill cloth is cut, they staple it to the baffle. Then they staple the piping onto the baffle. Then that is inserted inside the cabinet. The speaker is then mounted, and then the chassis is inserted. Now that amp is done. It's ready to go to its next step, which is sound testing, to listen to see if there's any rattles or vibrations or buzzes or whatever in the cabinet or tube assembly. And that then is its final test. We've evolved our cabinets through many years, our extension cabinets, and we kind of evolved it to this design here. This design basically incorporates a floating baffle so that we're able to take the same size box, which will fit right underneath one of our combos, and run it as a 112 or a 210, depending upon the baffle that we use. It is a floating baffle, which is a little bit different than a lot of our designs, and it allows the cabinet to have a little bit more resonance. When you have a baffle that's not dadoed into the cabinet, it is a little bit more alive, so you get a little bit more alive sound. Another feature that we brought out with these cabinets is that it can be either closed back or open. So by removing these 6 machine screws, this back comes off, and now you have an open back cabinet. We kind of tuned the size of this opening to kind of get the best kind of resonant sound out of the cabinet. And you'll find that, say you're playing a room and there's no stage and you're on the floor. Boy, it's nice to have that back off, to get a little bit more area of a sound, to come around and engulf you and fill the room a little bit better with sound. But if you're on a stage and you're mic'd, boy, it's nice to have that closed. Get a little bit more percussive, crunchy tones out of your amp with a closed back cabinet. And this cabinet will do both for you. Here's our 410 open back cab. Kind of had a feeling that we needed a 410 cab. A lot of people do like the sound of a 4-speaker cabinet and its push and punch. So years ago, I did a lot of repairs on amps, as talked about how we got started. And one of the things that I would have to do to like old Tweed Bassmans was replace the baffle because they were damaged, falling apart, whatever, 1959 amplifiers. So this was the size of a 410 Bassman baffle. So when I decided to do a 410 cab, I said, wow, that's the best sounding 410 amp I've ever heard in my life. Why not incorporate the size of this baffle into the size of this cabinet? And that's basically what I did. So this is primarily a 410 Bassman cabinet baffle in an open back 410 cabinet, and it sounds exquisite. Here's our 212 open back cabinet. We found that we had a need for an open back 212. Most of our country players kind of asked for that. They're not ones to really like a tuned and boarded cabinet for their style of music. They really wanted something open. So that was basically what we did to incorporate a lot of our Voxier sounding amps. Okay, here's the back shot of this 212 cabinet. And as you can see, we did kind of tune it. You know, we tried to make sure that the port opening was such that we would get a nice pleasant sound coming out the back. And that's what this does. So it's an open back cabinet with lots of ambience and lots of open sound. It's a little bit tuned so that there's no muffling or cancellation of any sounds. And it sounds very good and is a very solid open back cabinet. All amps need to have speakers if you want to hear them played. Okay, we talked a lot about how amplifiers were made, cabinets put together, but let's talk a little bit now about the final transducer, the thing that you hear, which really makes your amp, and makes an electric guitar amp an electric guitar amp. Here at Dr. Z's, we kind of like Celestions. We lean toward that kind of classic Celestion tone. If you think back to any recording that you've heard throughout the 70s and 80s, probably every one of them has been made through a Celestion speaker or Celestion or Marshall cabinet. So very, very much ingrained in the sound that we like to hear. I use various Celestion speakers in my amps, and I allow customers to kind of pick and choose. They can upgrade to some speakers or take our suggestion as to what we think sounds best with a specific model. One speaker that I like a lot and we use very much is the G12H30. Now, this was really kind of a 70th anniversary speaker that Celestion put out that was kind of their original 30-watt speaker. A problem happened was after they went through their 70th year anniversary, they stopped importing these speakers. So, you know, I contacted my Celestion rep and even went as far as to talk to Andy Farrow in the UK and said, hey man, this is the best sounding speaker you guys make. You can't stop importing these. So after a little bit of time, they did start making them again, thank God, because like I said, we use them quite a bit. And we match and pair this speaker up with another favorite speaker of mine from Celestion, which is their Vintage 30. So we kind of combine these a lot in our 212s, both in our Z-Best cab and also in our Mass 38 212 combo. The combination of these two speakers is nice because one has a little bit more of what the other one lacks, and combining the two gives you a nice broad bandwidth. The Vintage 30 is a little bit brighter. It has a little bit more bite and attack to it, where the H30 is a little bit warmer, has a little bit more lower mid response, okay? This one has a little bit more upper mid response. So when you pair the two together, they sound pretty nice. One thing that Celestion did, finally, was reissue their famous Alnico Blue. Okay, this was certainly the sound of rock and roll for many years, especially during the early 60s. Pretty much everything you heard was recorded through one of these speakers. These are the speakers that were in the Voxes. They gave that Beatles jangly tones, all came through these. And it does incorporate a ringed Alnico magnet. Now, it's not just an Alnico slug like you see in a lot of the older Jensen speakers, but this is a machined Alnico magnet. So it's a pretty expensive procedure to build. Alnico is basically 3 rare earth materials. It's aluminum, nickel, and cobalt. That's what makes up Alnico. And it's a very, very nice warm magnet. It's not quite as harsh or sharp as a ceramic magnet is. A ceramic magnet has a little bit faster transient response. An Alnico magnet's a little bit slower, a little bit warmer. You can see that even on a lot of the Alnico pickups that you have on your guitars. That's what makes this speaker what it is. And because of the Alnico magnet, that's what makes the cost so high. So this is a wonderful speaker, but it did have one drawback. And that one drawback was that it was only 15 watts. It's a very low wattage speaker. So what Celestion eventually came up with was their Gold, which is a 50-watt Alnico speaker. It took them a long time to be able to develop a speaker with the proper former that would dissipate the kind of wattage that they needed and still give that nice papery former sound of the 15-watt speaker. And I believe they were able to do it. The one trick that I found with these Golds is that you do really have to push them kind of hard. So if we have a 40 or a 45 watt amp, I'll just use one of these speakers in it, and boy, it pushes it nice, and it will get to the type of tone that a Blue will give you. So those are pretty much the 12s that we use, and then that brings us to our own speaker, which is a 10 that I had designed for myself to use in our amps. And it's a very efficient 10-inch speaker. It's got a big sound. As you can see, it's got a magnet very close to the size of a magnet that would be on a 12-inch speaker. What that does is it gives me great low-end response. So I have a smaller cone speaker, which gives me a lot of punch. I mean, that's the idea of using a 10. A 10 is very quick to respond to your attack. But it can lack a little bit of low end that a larger cone speaker will give you. So with the larger magnet and the little higher wattage, I'm able to get a 10 that sounds very similar to a 12, but responds like a 10. I've been asked a lot, what speaker should I use in my amp? Pretty much the generic answer that I give a guy is pretty much the style of music that you're playing. If you're playing a roots style music, that means country or blues or jazz, a 10-inch speaker works very well for that. It works great for the double stops. It works great for the clarity and punch that country music and jazz need. And it's also very nice for blues. But if you're a rock player and you play traditionally rock music, boy, every recording that you're listening to is a Celestion 12. So why not get a 12? As far as which type of 12 or speaker to go into the amp, well, that kind of determines on which amp it is. And we do kind of select what we feel is best for that specific model. We talked about inspiration coming from artists. Well, this next amp that I have here, the Galaxy, was actually an inspiration from a manufacturer. I received a call from Triad Transformer Company. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Triad, but Triad was the company that made all of the Tweed transformers for Fender. And they had a little meeting, I guess, and they all said, you know what, maybe we should start making transformers again for guitar amplifiers. So they went down a list, called a few manufacturers. I happened to be one of them. And they asked me, what transformer of our old transformers that we made would you like us to make for you? So I thought about it, and a thought came to my mind of an amp that I had heard and worked on and played for many years, and that was the Tweed Super. Now, that was a 210 version of kind of like a 410 Bassman. It was a 6L6 amp, but a lower powered 6L6 amp. And it did have some unique circuits to it. One of them was a cathodiene phase inverter. Now, a cathodiene phase inverter is a little different than a long tail. A cathodiene is not going to give you full power. But what a cathodiene does is it kind of gives you an asymmetric drive. So its output is a little richer in third and fifth harmonic distortion. Amps that use that cathodiene phase inverter are like the Princeton. So when you compare the sound of a Princeton and a Deluxe, which uses the long tail, that's the kind of difference. And that's the difference that the Super had compared to a 410 Bassman. So I kind of like that. I like the sound that amp made. So I had asked them to build that transformer for me. So they did, and they sent it to me. So I kind of went about building a Tweed Super amp. And I said, well, I got to make this my own. I got to do a little bit of my own magic to it. So on the second channel, I made it so it was foot switchable. So you could have channel 1, which was basically a tweed, nice, clean tweed amp. Nice little hair on the notes, just like a normal tweed. But then on channel 2, I went full bore. I gained the heck out of it. And, you know, that really is a testament for Leo Fender's early designs, how we've evolved them. Marshall and everyone else has taken those basic premise designs and then been able to build upon them to make more modern kind of amps. And basically that's what happened, and that's how the Galaxy turned out. It has a 5 U4 rectifier tube, 2 6L6s, and a very original output transformer, which gives it a nice sound. So working with 6L6 tubes, I kind of went a little bit further. Talk about the sound in your head. Well, I've always had the sound in my head of what a great blackface amp would sound like. Now, Leo never really made a head of his blackface amps. And I thought he went a little bit short with his reverb too. So I kind of took the design of a blackface amp, added a 2-knob reverb, so there's dwell and mix. So you can go anywhere from Dick Dale to a very subtle reverb with these 2 controls. And you have a very rich blackface Fender sound. Now, I did also put a pre and a post volume on the amp. People say, well, you know, what's that for, Dr. Z? Well, basically, with a super reverb, there's a sweet spot where that amp just sounds like no other, and it's around 3.5 to 4 on the volume control. The problem is that's always too loud when you're in a club and you're playing. But boy, that's where the amp really starts to breathe. So I put a pre and a post master control on it so that you can achieve that same kind of drive and that nice sweet sound that the Super had at different volume levels. So you're able to achieve that great sound at different volume levels. And that's basically the EZ-G50. We use a pretty sophisticated way to pack our amps here. And I found through my 21 years of building guitar amps that it's very, very important that we pack them very well. Because once they're out of our hands and they're in the truck driver's truck, who knows what's going to happen to them. So we do use this blow-in foam application to the amps. And what that does is it really forms almost like a road case around the box to safely get that amp from here to your house. So the first thing that we do is we have the box and we take and blow in a base form of this sealant. It starts to rise. Then the amp is put inside that box as the foam starts to expand, and we hold it up so that we get 1 inch or 2 of foam underneath, around the sides, and coming up the walls of the box. Then we take and put a top piece on of this foil. Now this foil is heat retardant, so it's not going to melt. The amp is wrapped in it. They put that over the top and then blow in some more foam to do the top cap, as we call it. Once that's blown in, then the flaps are closed of the amp while this expands, because we want to make sure that the foam goes down into the amp and not up out the top. So we hold on to the top. Once that stops forming, then the amp is ready to be taped up and put on a truck and get to your house in one piece. I thought of you when I designed this, Joe. It's got 4 6V6s.
Oh, you did it finally.
Right. And a very unique half power switch. And it works like none other. I've got a patent that I'm trying to get on this circuit. Also, I put a built-in attenuator. So now you can click. They tell you, Joe, you're too loud, turn down. You got a built-in attenuator, air brake attenuator on it. It's got an effects loop. Full and half power. It's got a
Wow.
fan, keep everything nice and cool. Sounds great at 20 watts, sounds excellent at 40 watts.
Wow.
This is the first one I've done. So put your name in there.
Wow.
And it also has, you know, reverb and trim. So I put
Yeah.
tremolo in for
Yeah.
you.
You did?
Right? It's got a nice master vibe. I remember working on your magnetones. So I thought, well, let me put a nice little trem in there for Joe.
I call him up and I tell him, are you filming? Hi, how you doing? I call him up and I tell him all this crazy stuff. And I think, well, what can I do to really make him throw up his arms in disgust? And I haven't gotten him yet. He does it. I never planned that he would do it. Here we go again.
So this is it. I mean, you've got volume, treble, middle, bass. There's a master volume.
Yeah.
There's a reverb and a trim. You got a two switch foot.
So it's got attenuator, master volume, and half power.
And an right. So you've got three. Remember, you've always told me, they said the stage volume, you gotta be low, you gotta turn it down.
Yeah.
I can't get my tone.
Yeah.
I think this is gonna be the amp that is gonna be able to do all
Wow,
that.
it looks nice too.
Thank you.
I thought you had a speaker shape like that. I was gonna say. Nah, that's pushing it, see.
Just to hear.
Yeah, that'd be nice. I want to hear this tremolo.
Okay, got a,
Oh yeah.
I had to borrow a Fender switch. I didn't have a chance to fabricate a new one.
Yeah. Okay.
But we will do that.
Well, there's a mystique about Mike. In Nashville, I have a Z amp in Nashville. I had one down there for an award show, and everybody came over and looked at it and walked around it and stood and said, "Wow," and had to look in the back. I don't know why. But Brad Paisley and all them guys, they go nuts when they see a new one. Because everyone's different, you know? They aren't mass produced. They are. I mean, there's a foundational circuits and stuff. But you got to talk to them for a while when you want an amp and give them a feel for what you want. And every amp is really different, and every amp that I have has its own personality. And I've been able to tell him the kind of sound that I wanted or had been trying to get. And I have some technical knowledge, but you know, as a musician, sometimes you have to say that you want it a little more yellow and not so green. And he'll get that. He knows what you're trying to accomplish, which is something that is really rare with a tech guy. When you can really talk finesse and guitar sounds, because a lot of it's in the feel. And unless you really play guitar, it's really hard to get across the way you want it to feel, the way you want it to respond and stuff. So Z has always been invaluable to me, that we can have a half-hour talk about it. And it's right there. It's right there when it arrives. And also, I've been a ham radio operator since like 1961. So sometimes we will get into the theory of it, or talking about circuits and why is this resistor that value, and what do we do if we need it, thinner for a single coil or fatter for a double coil. And he's right there. He always he can back it up with theory and circuit design and tell you a couple different parameters to go there. Sometimes I'll make him really uncomfortable. Because I said, well, let's try that. And he says, Joe, you can't do that. And I said, let's do it. Let's do it anyway. And sometimes that works. If it's my idea, it usually doesn't work. But if it's his idea, it works great. So anyway, that's what he's all about. Well, this is nice.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we need to make this a little dirtier, but not necessarily louder. How do you want to do that?
Well, we can do it this way. Go to half power.
Okay. Yeah, bring that up a little. Good. Get a little more mid out. Really clean, isn't it? That's a good telly sound. Well, like I say, everyone is different, depending on who he built it for wanted. I have some really old ones. How old are those ones?
Going back probably 16, 17 years.
Yeah.
1990, early 90s, maybe even older than that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, older than that, I think.
Yeah. And those were the SRZs. That was the one, remember, you took when you went to, with Cheney, or who was it that you toured with?
Kenny.
Kenny Chesney.
Yeah.
That's it, Kenny Chesney.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
You just blew him away with that old Z amp.
Yeah. Yeah, he made me some. I used it in the Eagles for a long time. We don't play that loud anymore, so they're. I saved them for special occasions. But I went out with Kenny Chesney and just toured, because the Eagles were in the studio recording, and I got bored because it was singing time. So I went out and played some shows with Kenny, and I took 2 stacks, 8 12s and 2 tops.
Mm-hmm. You showed them what it was about.
And they all had Marshalls. And I blew them away. Blew them away with half the power. And those are there. I wouldn't get rid of those for anything in the world. They just sounded amazing. And again, I had his entire band around behind the amps, trying to see what the hell was in there to make it sound like that. What's the little single 12 that I played slide on? I don't know the name of them all. A Gia?
Carmen Gia, right?
Yeah,
right.
Carmen Gia. I used that. The one I played was Ringo on Jay Leno, I guess. And for slide, I use it for slide. For some reason, it's just absolutely sweet.
Man, so simple. 2 knobs, a
Yeah.
Fox Blue.
Yeah,
It don't get no purer than that.
yeah. And people still tell me it's the most amazing slide sound they've ever heard come through, a television speaker.
Nice.
And over the years, I've just checked in with him, and we've built stuff. So I have probably 10 by now,
At least.
probably 10 amps. And I wouldn't get rid of any of them for anything in the world. Prestwich, I found a couple on the road. I found a couple used, running around, and people didn't know what they had. Well, one store they did, so I paid through the nose to get it, but one store they didn't. And I got a good deal, so it averages out. It just sounds great, man. That's all I can tell you. It just sounds wonderful. There it opens up, huh? Okay. I love this.
Thanks, Joe.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it.
Cool. I've got a box for you if you want me to send it to California. You want to take it?
No,
with
I'll
you
take it and put it in the truck.
Okay.
God, I'm just grateful. I'm grateful. I'm grateful.
You got a loop. You also got the attenuator. You'll play with it. You'll find all the sounds that are inside of this,
It
Joe.
just comes in perfect time, dude.
Nice. Oh, good. Good. I'm so happy. I thought I'd surprise you with a little something.
Thanks so much.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure, Joe. All the years we've spent.
Lucky me.
It goes both ways.
Adios, amigos. Bueno, we're right.